Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at Elizabethtown College. I'm Steve Nault, and delighted to see all of you here this afternoon. Delighted to see all of you here this afternoon for our 2023 KREIDER seminar, featuring the long-awaited completion of Volume 3 of Documents of Brotherly Love, Dutch Mennonite Aid to Swiss Anabaptists, Volume 3, covering the years 1712 to 1784, a massive project that completes what had commonly been called the Amsterdam Archives Project. That project began, I believe, 26 years ago or so. I've seen copies from the first meeting and the first minutes from the first meeting that took place in August of 1997. The minutes, I think, somewhat optimistically suggested the project might take about a year or a little more to complete. But that project that began in August of 97 at a meeting at Mennonite Life, then the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, involved Urban Horst, Carolyn Wanger, John Ruth, and a number of other folks. We will be hearing more about that, the origins and about the project itself. So I won't say much more now about that project, the details of the project, other than it involved many people, including many people who are in this room. It involved financial support from a variety of organizations and the efforts of individuals who are no longer with us, as well as, again, many people who are here in this room. Before I introduce our speakers for this afternoon, a word of thanks and a word of explanation. Thanks to the family of Ken and Carol KREIDER, who through the KREIDER Endowment here at the Young Center have made this event possible, particularly our ability to bring Lydia Penner, whom we'll be hearing from later this afternoon and this evening, bringing her here from the Netherlands. And we're grateful to the KREIDERs for their generosity. Second, an announcement, and a disappointing announcement. Some of you are aware, but all of us are disappointed that actual copies of the book, Documents of Brotherly Love, Volume 3, which were promised to be here, are not here. Indeed, the printer had promised they would be here, but they are not. They are to be shipped, hopefully, the end of this week or the beginning of next week from Tennessee. The actual books should be available Thursday, April 13th at 7 p.m. at the Martindale Reception Center. So that's the next target date that we are hoping for from the printer. This afternoon, we have three speakers. They will each speak for about 30 minutes. And after they have all spoken, we'll have a combined question and answer time. So please hold your questions until the end. This is the way we will proceed. First, by hearing from John Ruth, then from Edsel Burdge, then we'll have a brief break, stretch, use the restroom, so on. Then we'll be hearing from Lydia Penner, and then we will have a combined question and answer time. So that's the kind of outline of where we're going today. And in between several of the speakers, I'll also be up here setting up some things with projection, because some of our speakers have slides they'd like to use. We'll begin by hearing about the origins and development of the Amsterdam Archives Project, the origins of the Documents of Brotherly Love project. On the table, for those of you who are not familiar, we have volumes 1 and 2, and you may want to page through those during some of the breaks or afterward, but these are the first two of the 3 volumes that provide transcriptions and translations of hundreds of documents related to many things, but among them Mennonite migration to Pennsylvania in the 18th century, as facilitated by Dutch Mennonites. So we'll begin by hearing about the origins and development of this project that has brought us these volumes and all of this transcription and translation. John Ruth will be sharing on the story of the Amsterdam Archives Project. Many of you know John. He is a historian and author from Harleysville, Pennsylvania, whose books include The Earth is the Lord's, A Narrative History of the Lancaster Mennonite Conference, and more recently, This Very Ground, This Crooked Affair, a Mennonite homestead on Lenape land. John.
I'm walking more carefully than I did 26 years ago when this started. I've been asked to give an account of the project. Nice to see so many people out for something like this. We worked pretty much as a small committee over the years. Nobody ever elected us, appointed us, or anything. It just happened. And that was a wonderful thing. It came out of character rather than calculation. And we experienced that over and over. It has seemed appropriate. Now, I will speak from an somewhat supplemented version of the introduction I wrote for Volume 3. It has seemed appropriate to the committee sponsoring the 3-volume documents of brotherly love to leave on record at its long-awaited completion the unusual story of this project. Certainly, had it been imagined at the outset in 1997 that it could take 8 times longer than the effort a Dunker Peter Miller had needed to translate the Dutch Martyr's Mirror to German 250 years earlier, the second effort would not have been begun. But, as phrased in an unusual appendix to Miller's translation in 1748 and 9 in there, its chief promoters, unschooled Mennonite ministers Henry Funk and Tilman Cole, living 60 miles east of Ephrata, had been motivated by what Peter Miller said was Eine besondere Liebe. It was that same exceptional love that moved this writer, and that's me, a ministerial successor in Cobb's congregation at Salford, to suggest another related translation of a corpus of Dutch and German correspondence as old as the Great Mirror. Archived in Amsterdam, the documents contained a 14 decades long story of Dutch Doopsgezindten aid to needy Mennonites in Switzerland, the Palatinate, and Pennsylvania from 1645 to 1784. Though they had been professionally inventoried in 1883 and 84, over the following century, that collection had been only occasionally and partially consulted. There were parallels beyond the shared address of Ephrata and the concern for faithful translation in the 2 story translating projects I've referred to here. For each, a linguist of non-Anabaptist origins, but strong spiritual sympathy could be found. The one at Ephrata knowing 7 languages, the other in 5, and both being fluent in Latin. And memorably, just as while the earlier project was being finished at Ephrata, the contents from an old document brought in from a nearby farm had been inserted in the margins. So, as long as the editors kept working on the second project, documents from other sources than the Amsterdam collection would be added. Now, I don't know how far I'll get in this speech here, but Steve will tell me when my time runs out, and then we'll just leave the rest to Martindale. In 1877, a worldly young Philadelphia lawyer named Samuel Whitaker Pennypacker, curious as to the spiritual heritage of his great-grandfather, Mennonite Bishop Matthias Pennebaker of Chester County, sent an inquiry to a historical bookstore in Amsterdam. See, Pennypacker, because his grandfather was a Mennonite bishop, assumed that he had Mennonite ancestry in Europe. He didn't, because the Pennypackers had joined over here. But that's all right. He got it. He got the project rolling. He sent an inquiry to a bookstore in Amsterdam. A delayed reply that corrected several of the Americans' assumptions was signed by the director of Amsterdam's Doopsgezind or Mennonite Archives, Dr. Jacob. And I'm going to ask Lydia Penner how to pronounce this. How do you say Gisbert or Gisbert? Gijsbert. Well, I'm not up to that. Now, let me ask you this, Lydia. Is it Scheffer or Skeffer? Skeffer. All right. I'll work on it. It's time at last to get this right, I guess. But the learned 58-year-old professor at the University of Amsterdam had been he had been a minister prior to that, had been deeply immersed in Dutch Mennonite history. 8 years earlier than Pennypacker's inquiry, he had published in the young Anabaptist contributions that he had, Doopsgezind Bijdragen, or however you say it, that he edited an article he entitled, in English, it would be Friendly Relations Between the Mennonites in Holland and Those in Pennsylvania. I was back in 1869 in his young magazine, quarterly or whatever it was. For that, he drew on the great historical archive in the library of his church, there in the Single Canal, which he had been cataloging already for several years. He was delighted to hear from somebody sending him an American printed Mennonite book, a songbook. And he began a series of 25 letters to this lawyer, Pennypacker. They happened to be residing in later became Governor Pennypacker, and his retirement mansion is just a few miles from my house, and those letters are sitting there where I live east of here. Those letters were written by Scheffer in a fluent English, which, as I say, permanently preserved at Schwenksville, Pennsylvania. He explained that relations between the Dutch Doopsgezinden and emigrating Palatine Mennonites after 1707 had produced what he called much correspondence between Rotterdam and Amsterdam, as those people, being poor for the greater part, were in need of means and advice. In fact, wrote Scheffer, about 50 of such letters are before me now. 3 of the 4 most interesting ones from Pennsylvania, which he had abridged in his opening article of 1869, were dated 1708, 1745, and 1758. And if his American inquirer would care to have a copy of those letters, wrote Scheffer, I will send it to you with much pleasure. Well, Pennypacker responded with enthusiasm. And he took the 1869 Dutch article and footnoted it, translated it, and published it under his and Scheffer's name in a thing called the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in 1878. He entitled it Mennonite Emigration to Pennsylvania, Friendly Relations Between the Mennonites in Holland and Those in Pennsylvania. This pleased historian Scheffer, who commented that he would not wish for anything better. He thanked Pennypacker for sending him 2 more American books. Bishop Henry Funk's little Spiegel der Taufe, mirror of baptism, came out of the results of the Mennonites jockeying with the Dunkers in my community. Of 1744, the first American Mennonite written book, and an edition of the writings of Minnow Simons that had been published in America. With the sophistication of a European scholar, Scheffer was touched by the provincial rudeness of the American-produced books. They are very much like the German ones, he wrote, rough, confirming an old saying, in Latin saying, they change their sky, but not their soul, who rush across the sea. But no matter, quote, how dirty their books may be, he wrote, they remain welcome to me as a collector. In fact, I can never write to you without having to thank you for some such proof of friendship. The busy Dutch archivist was looking forward with great longing for a book Pennypacker was writing about the settlement of Germantown, the Mennonites in colonial Pennsylvania. But when Pennypacker inquired whether the professor would be, quote, willing to sell manuscripts regarding the emigration from the Palatinate to Pennsylvania to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the urging scholar replied, I beg to say that we are in no way disposed to do so. He would, however, quote, find much pleasure in having clear copies made of everything relating to the colonization of the Mennonites to Pennsylvania that could be found in the records of the Mennonite congregation here. In response to an immediate order, Scheffer, who at the time was preparing to publish an inventory or inventars of many documents in the congregation's great archive, he worked with greatest care to provide Pennypacker with some 150 freshly copied pages. Receiving them in October 1882 must have only intensified Pennypacker's interest, since by the next October, he had been sent another 450 folio pages representing, quote, every one of the documents you've desired. That was in 1883. I was under the impression in 1997 that I was starting something. I just joined the late phases of it, actually. Pennypacker's mounting enthusiasm for his incorrectly conceived Mennonite Dutch ancestry had him giving an address on the subject in Philadelphia's Academy of Music in October 1883. This caught the eye and ear of a man raised in my rural Salford congregation, who, right after Pennypacker's first publication in 1878, had plunged into his own castle and Kolb ancestry, and he would cite the speech in the Academy of Music in a book called Geschichte of the Mennonites of 1890 of his own, this unschooled writer, Daniel Castle. In the same year, a younger lawyer raised in Lancaster County near New Holland, Edwin K. Martin, also showed the effect of Pennypacker's early work, as he contributed an invidiously ancestor-praising article to a new Lancaster County history, 1883. Having finally, through the English translation of the Scheffer's original article, gained some vivid access to his people's story, Martin could announce in an essay contributed to the New Lancaster County history that though his ancestral Mennonites were, quote, the most interesting people who came to America, their story is yet untold. So the atmosphere of the Scheffer data had been introduced to Lancaster County 114 years before it would be taken up by our committee. It was in that interval of 1883 and 84 that Scheffer began publishing his inventars, or his annotated catalog of the correspondence, a selection of which would be laid open to the public in both the original and English languages for the first time in the present series entitled documents of brotherly love. Anticipating the experience of our transcribers and translators for the later project, Scheffer's observation was that the language of the documents in German was, quote, rather imperfect and the meaning not always very clear. In fact, it had offered his own copyist, quote, very much difficulty. I'm going to have to skip some of all this, or else we won't get to 1997. Skip some of this. Daniel K. Castle, his books of 1888 and 1890, the first American books on Mennonite history. Remember, from the Salford congregation, he'd grown up in my congregation, but he had failed in business and had joined the what we call the New Mennonites, the Progressive Eastern District. His neighbors had taken a dim view of what they considered his possibly commercial motivation. One minister wrote in 1887 that he's no member in our church, whatever. He was in his earlier years baptized to our church. In fact, he taught school in my congregation for 20 years, I believe. But he was a high-minded man and went into business, and so people lost a good deal of money on him, and from that time he was no member. In fact, he was a deacon at the Germantown Mennonite, barely existing in Germantown at that time. Certainly the old Mennonites, paging through his groundbreaking books, which you can only read with some respect. He took a lot of inspiration from the breakthrough in 1878 when Pennypacker published. Next year, he started working on the Kolb and Castle histories. But the old Mennonites would have disdained his insertion of a portrait of himself opposite the title pages of his 1888 English history and 1890 German Geschichte. But he would be cited already in 1895 by a Bernese historian, and later genealogists cannot help but appreciate his histories of the Castle, Culp, and Rittenhouse families appearing before his death in 1898, and now can be seen on screens around the globe. In the year of 1890, when Daniel Castle's second book appeared, Pennypacker, still a lawyer, not governor of Pennsylvania yet, visited Amsterdam, where he was able to spend a very pleasant evening with none other than the retired, now white-haired Professor Scheffer, talking about Mennonite literature. This seems to have also been about when the traveling American found on sale somewhere and purchased a copy of a uniquely important document that was not part of Scheffer's archive. It was the substantial report from Pennsylvania of March 1773, number 223 in volume 3 of Brotherly Aid, volume 3, that would give historians their best glimpse of the American Mennonite scene before the Revolutionary War. Pennypacker published it in English translation in a privately printed book of 1894 entitled Hendrik Pannebecker, Surveyor of Lands for the Pens. That is in volume 3. Both Scheffer's inventory and even Castle's efforts were noticed by Ernst Müller, the Swiss Reformed pastor of a congregation in the Bernese Emmental, who in 1895 published an award-winning and groundbreaking history of the Bernese Anabaptists of his own. He credited the recently deceased Scheffer's successor, not Scheffer himself, Simon Kramer, for help, but used Scheffer's numbering of the documents that he had cited in the inventory. After the Civil War, many more Americans than Pennypacker were traveling by steamship, In the summer of 1899, Scheffer's widow received a visit by a young Mennonite minister from Millersville in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He was less historically obsessed than the previous visitor, who was soon to be elected governor of Pennsylvania. But like him, the Virginian-born 32-year-old Amos Daniel Winger offered to buy some history. In Winger's case, talking to Mrs. Scheffer, a tongue screw by which Anabaptists had been tortured. Although his hostess proved unwilling to sell at any price, and I guess they still show it. I remember seeing that in about 1968 when I traveled to the Single Kirk. Somebody brought it right out of there and saw this tongue screw, which gives you the chills to see some put on an Anabaptist woman before she was, I believe, executed. Then a more history-oriented Mennonite came with the desire of seeing the immense Mennonite library with its more than 20,000 volumes and thousands of letters and other valuable documents and pictures. Who was this? He was a 50-year-old pastor of the liberal First Mennonite Congregation of Philadelphia, Nathaniel Bertlet Grubb, who was the leading spirit of the Eastern or Liberal General Conference Mennonites of Pennsylvania. He wanted to see those letters from 1708, 45, and 58. During the following decade, with the approach of the 200th anniversary of the 1710 migration that brought Mennonites to Lancaster, what became Lancaster County. You remember that? We are earlier in Germantown. And then we dribble in and in 1709 again. But in 1710, from the Kraichgau, comes the Millers and the Mylans and the Hers from the Kraichgau and buy this manor out in Lancaster. As the 200th anniversary of that came up in 1910, Nathaniel Grubb, N.B. Grubb, promoted historical awareness. He secured copies, as he called it, of the three important documents from Scheffer, and he had them made by the assistant at the library and archives room of the United Anabaptist Congregation in 1909, and he presented them translated as nearly literal as possible in print for the first time, he thought, in the Mennonite Yearbook and Almanac of 1910. Meanwhile, there was a Mennonite history student from Ohio studying at the University of Chicago. His name was C. Henry Smith. He was wanting to do a PhD thesis in history, and in 1906, he'd come to Lancaster, gone to Virginia and Philadelphia, and completed his thesis, published in 1909 as The Mennonites of America. Young Smith thought it would be the last book on that subject for 50 years. When the big celebration came in 1910, 2,000 attendees came to the bicentenary event at Willow Street in Lancaster County. The atmosphere, with florid speeches by now ex-Governor Pennypacker and Minister Grubb, lauding their heritage, was too worldly in tone to find approval from most of the local Mennonites. It would be another half century before interest in their historical background would find major expression. The enthusiastic main speaker at that 19 celebration was a local Mennonite descended man named H. Frank Eshelman, who in 1917 then published a chronologically styled book entitled Historic Background and Annals of the Swiss and German Pioneer Settlers of Southeastern Pennsylvania. Like C. Henry Smith, Eshelman had consulted the, quote, Dutch copies deposited by Pennypacker in Philadelphia a generation earlier and gotten help in translation by N.B. Grubb. Then in 1920, another book by C. Henry Smith called The Mennonites, A Brief History of Their Origin and Later Development in Both Europe and America, showed more reference to the Skeffer documents in Philadelphia. And in that same year came a little book called A Report of the First Burkholder Family Reunion. And it quoted letters from Palatine Bishop Hans Burkholder back in the 1740s. Where did he get them? From the Skeffer Archive in Philadelphia. Well, I'm going to have to, all right, I'm going to skip Ira Landis. His dream, was to write the book that finally fell into my lap. And I think he'd have put things in there that I never found. He did create that marvelous genealogical index, 4x6. I now, I'm sure. Is it online? Is it? Okay. And then there was Irvin Horst, who became a professor, you might say, in a way, a follower of Skeffer in the University of Amsterdam. A special office, he said, was created for him to be a Lancaster boy who grew up, knew the Dutch language, and he called our attention to, in 1984, I believe, he published a number of things, including a brochure saying that those letters needed to be consulted. And here I was trying, and as amateur, not trained in history, trying to write a history of Lancaster, and had from Goshen College photocopies of the inventaris, which had only 2 or 3 line summaries of what was in them. And the stuff that was in it that had texture and would be palpable, I could only guess at. And I thought, what am I doing writing this history without access to that? Didn't make sense. After all, what we didn't realize at the time was there were at least 4 other scholars hard at work on it. One was Hans Peter Jecker, young Hans Peter Jecker. I'm missing a part of his name. From Basel. He'd been there looking through the Skeffer archives in 1992. And then come Rosalind Byler, grew up in Lancaster County. She was looking through the Ira Landis had a poor photocopy. I tried to look at them of the archive of the documents, and they were upside down and backwards and dark and never went anywhere. And then there was Jeremy Bangs. I met him in Leiden. He was a genealogical historian working for an outfit in New England, and he stumbled across him. And he asked in the single character there, he said, is anybody working on this? And they said, no. He said, well, I'll do it. At least that's what he told me. And when let me tell you just this story yet. It was on that day in the fall of 1997. Here I am frustrated. I don't know anything about, all I know is I'm trying to write a history about something that the rich deposit was there and I can't get at it. And so one day in the summer of 1997, my old roommate at LMS, Paul Kurtz, said to me, he said, some of those Kurtzes we'd be willing to pay somebody to go over to Europe and look up our background. That evening, I was at the Alleghenyville hymn sing that we had for 30 years or something like that. And a man named James Lowry, after the singing was over, came and he said, I'd like to go to the Netherlands. I've just written this book on the Martyr's Mirror for, how's the title? Made Plain. But I'd like to go to the Netherlands and get the feel of the Dutch language. Well, I thought, I got 2 requests in the same day, and the thought hit me, I wonder if you could get them together and look into, would you be willing to look at those letters over there? I said to him. Well, that was a novel idea to him. But then he remembered that the thing he'd done best at the University of Chicago was paleography, working with old written stuff. So he wrote a letter to my buddy Paul Kurtz and said, maybe there's a possibility here. The upshot was that within 3, 4, 5 months, James and Mattie were over at Alsmeer, south of Amsterdam, and he was looking into those letters and starting to make arrangements to make microfilms. That was the first thing he did. First, you made a microfilm, and then you printed it, then you transcribed it, and then you translated it. And how far did he get that first year? Got the microfilms and got to learn the Dutch language. Well, as you can see, my story is too dense. There's more to it here. Maybe our committee can make it available. Anyway, that was I guess I'll read the last page. Can I do that yet? When you get old enough, even little things like this, getting pages apart, become an issue. Okay. Here. Concluding their work on a hill named Fairmount, only a few miles from the Ephrata on the Kokalico, the volunteer committee was still driven by the besondere Liebe, recorded 238 years earlier by the translator of the Martyr's Mirror. Now, in 2021, that special love that had linked Dutch and Swiss German Anabaptists, and again in the 1880s had motivated a scholar to catalog the epistolary evidence for that story, was opening his trove at last to English readers. For the committee, both the story itself and the work of recovering that story had been a merging at the threshold of an awakening to history. Born out of amateur longing, but confirmed by scholarship, the project was multiple in meanings, the satisfying of a curiosity for what lay archivally buried in Amsterdam, thanks for that historic brotherly aid, a fulfilling of a Dutch historian's stewardship, and withal a contribution to researchers of scholarly orientation. But above all, in the story now brought out from deep storage, a new generation of ordinary, conscientious readers could meet characters like Hans Landis, Hermanus Skyn, Peter Kolb, Benedict Breckville, and Hans Burkholder. More than historical figures, they could now be known as ancestors in a story of a still living faith community. That special love encoded in the Anabaptist heritage they shared had made them brothers and sisters across time, not only of each other, but of future readers whose hearts, when freshly hearing stories of brotherly aid, would be touched, encouraged, and taught.
Thank you, John. And we are all looking forward to reading the entire introduction when volume 3 is in front of us. I'd like to introduce Edsel Burdge, research associate here at the Young Center and co-editor with Lydia Penner of volume 3 of Documents of Brotherly Love. He was invited to join the project in 2014 and became the group's secretary the following year. And he will share on what we learn about Anabaptist strategies for survival in 18th century Switzerland, the Rhineland, and North America, what we learned from these documents.
Okay, it's not quite up yet. All right. Okay, thank you, Steve. Well, I have taken the liberty to change my title. It's Swiss Brethren Strategies for Survival in 18th Century Switzerland and the Palatinate. And I'm going to look at survival in Switzerland and survival in the Palatinate. And I'm not going to kind of give you a comprehensive every blow sort of thing, but I want to look at kind of two different sets of events, one in Switzerland and one in the Palatinate. I think it should be mentioned that in October of last year, we lost James Lowry, who was the editor, the transcriber, the translator, a man of incredible ability and scholarship. And I think we all feel his loss because of that. And I would just say, as one of the co-editors of this third volume, I feel somewhat inadequate when I think about what James was able to do. And volume 3, I think, was an effort that included a lot of different persons, both in translating and transcribing and helping in so many things. And in that sense, it's somewhat of a good example of Mennonite community and corporate working together. Okay, Swiss Brethren Strategies for Survival in 18th century Switzerland and the Palatinate. Let's look first of all at Switzerland. On May 23rd, 1714, the Berne Council orders that 6 of the most guilty Anabaptists be sent to the galleys of the King of Sicily. The next day, they issued a mandate, and this is a copy of the mandate provided to us by the Berne City Archives, which references the 1710 banishment of Swiss brethren from Berne, from the canton of Berne, who were put on 4 barges and sent down the Rhine River with the idea that they were going to be taken to Rotterdam and sent over to North America, far away from Berne. Okay, get rid of these guys, they're problems. Well, when they got down the Rhine and they got to the Netherlands, the Dutch were not going to put up with that, and they were released, and they made their way into the Palatinate. And then some of them actually came back to Berne. And this angered the Bernese government. They were just beside themselves. And in this mandate, they said, we are resolved to rid ourselves of such disturbers once and for all. In any case, among those who are actually in prison here, some of which are preachers who earlier were already banished with threats of punishment of life and limb and on their oath and have returned, some able to work, are being sent to the galleys for life as a well-deserved punishment, and others will be permanently imprisoned here. The Bernese Reformed Church and government, they didn't hold they played for keeps, to tell you quite frankly. But you know why? What's the problem? What's the issue here? Why are these, as the government, Bernese government described it, as these disturbers of the peace? What were they doing? What were they advocating? Well, in 1721, a man by the name of Lucas Schmidt, who grew up Reformed in Basel, converted to Anabaptism, had to leave Basel as a consequence, writes to the Dutch Committee for Foreign Needs in Amsterdam asking for help. And in that, he gives a short summary of what he believes. And I will tell you that this is one of my favorite documents in the whole book, of 1,144 pages. He says, I want to tell you in all humility that I have been regenerated according to the clear word of Christ Jesus by the power of his Holy Spirit. zealously taking notice of the urge of the Spirit of Christ in me, giving heed to my conscience, guarding myself as best as I can against sin, working out my sanctification through continual prayer and fear and trembling, not resisting evil, laying down weapons, swearing neither a common nor a judicial oath, nor allowing my children to be baptized before they are able to believe, and going to church or to communion with none other than my fellow believers, in short, loving God and my neighbor as myself. Now that's the Swiss Brethren perspective of what was going on. But the Bernese government considered these people to be disturbers of the peace. And one of the things that particularly bothered them is that these folks, when they left, they were made to make promises. Now, they say they swore an oath. I don't think that, I think maybe that's the Reform way of looking at things. But they were forced to make promises, and some did, some didn't, it seems to me, but they were forced to make promises that they would not come back to Bern, because the thing that the Bernese government was, they wanted them out of there. All right. And this, but some made their way back. And this was puzzling to even some of their sympathizers. The Dutch Mennonites didn't quite get this. Well, why do you want to go back there? We worked hard to get you rescued from that situation. Why do you want to go back? There was a diplomat, John Ludwig Ronkel, who represented the Dutch States General, the ruling body in the Netherlands, as well as the Dutch Committee for Foreign Needs. You know, he could wear two hats at the same one. He lived at Schaffenhausen, and he was constantly working with the Bernese government to let up on these people. And he worked very hard in 1711 to get them out of there and so on. He didn't get it. We did all this work. Why are you going back? Well, in a January 6, 1708 letter from Jan Friedrichs of Denver to Herman Skyn, the Mennonite, let me see here, there we are. That's Herman Skyn, and he was a bishop, was the bishop at the Zoon Mennonite congregation in Amsterdam, wrote about the Swiss Brethren. In the first place, it is the case that the Friends meetings, which have to take place secret in the night, he's talking about the Swiss Brethren in Bern, attract many visitors from the state churches, to such an extent that many people, even those who have no intention of leaving the state church, appear there with the intention that through what is told there, they can give up some things to which they are strongly attached, and in that way improve their spiritual lives. One finds also some who go further and try to separate from the state church. This causes great hatred and bitterness. And of course, that's also one of the reasons why the Bernese government wants them out of there, because there are people from the Reformed state church who are attracted to Anabaptism and are leaving the state church, are becoming Anabaptists or joining the Swiss Brethren. Right? And he goes on to observe why they go back. Now, the congregations are almost never without infants in Christ. These are these newly converted people from the Swiss Reformed Church who are just opening their eyes and sincerely ask to have the way of truth shown to them. And as many of them cannot leave the country, and such well-meaning people with a clear conscience, since they fear that during their absence, such people may recant, and in this way, they would be the cause of their erring ways. And so one of the things that is fairly evident is that particularly some of the leaders who go back into Switzerland, some of the Swiss Brethren leaders who go back into Switzerland, they're doing it out of very keen pastoral concern for these newly converted members who need to be nurtured.
Could you put a little more power?
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me there? All right. Well, the Bernese government was still was determined to make an example of 4 of these leaders. They had a number of people who were incarcerated there in Bern, a number of Swiss Brethren who were incarcerated in Bern. But they only found 4 ministers: Hans Luthi, Nicholas Baumgartner, Peter Wuthrich, and Joseph Probst. And they were placed in strict confinement in the Tillinger Tower. And the plan was to send them to neighboring Savoy, to the Duke of Savoy, who also happened to be the king of Sicily, and they would then be sent to to row in the galleys of the king of Sicily. They were eventually to be sent to Sicily, essentially as slaves, as galley slaves. Well, on June 6, 1714, after these folks were put in the tower, another person came by, another Anabaptist, or Neutäufer, by the name of Christian Liebe. He's the leader among the Schwarzenau brethren, a new group, a new Täufer group, starting in Schwarzenau. Of course, that's the foundations or the beginnings of the brethren. Okay, he's traveling through Switzerland, through Bern. He's captured while he's traveling there, and he was ordered then to be sent with the 4 Swiss brethren leaders. On July 26, 1714, the Bern Council had received a report from, Colonel Karl Hackbrett, that the king of Sicily is willing to receive the prisoners. Now, Karl Hackbrett was a citizen of Switzerland, but he also happened to be an officer in the Duke of Savoy's army. That's where he gets his title colonel. And he's in Turin, the capital of the Dukedom of Savoy. And this is him here on this side. On the other side is Victor Amadeus, the second king of Sicily and the Duke of Savoy. All right. And so the Duke of Savoy agrees to receive them. Now, he gets paid for that. He has to pay for these guys. Okay. He has to pay a sum to the Bernese government for these folks. All right. And the Bernese government makes plans to send them under guard to Turin, the capital of Savoy, in August, as the first leg in their journey to Palermo in Sicily, the port of Palermo in Sicily. That's in July of 1714. August, they're sent to Turin. On November 26th, 1714, Benedict Breckbell, who himself had been in prison in 1709 and was released as part of those folks who were sent out in 1710, 1711. Okay, a bishop from the Emmental, a very important leader. Between 1709 and 1719, he's living at a place called Weiler, and this is the village of Weiler today, as it looks. I'm sorry, I have it wrong. You're right. It's 1717, John. Okay, 1719. He writes a letter from things. Okay, thanks, John, for that. I'll correct that later on. All right, and a brother from Switzerland came to Weiler, to Benedict Breckbell, and reported about these men who had been sent off to the Turin. And notice that one of their number, Nicholas Baumgartner, had died en route. So now they're down to 4 persons. He conjectures that Benedict Breckbell writes to the Dutch Committee for Foreign Needs that he has worked with before. And he conjectures that perhaps their release might be purchased. Several days later, Hans Jacob Schnebly from Mannheim writes to the Dutch Committee that the prisoners will stay the winter in Turin, where they will be imprisoned with, these are Schnebly's words, 98 scoundrels who also await deportation to Sicily. In December 1714, the Mennonites and the Palatinate were not the only persons concerned about the galley prisoners. A circle of radical pietists in Bern were also active on their behalf. This came to the attention of the Bern Toffer-Kramer, the Anabaptist Commission, who had hauled in Gabriel von Wattenwil for questioning. He was one of the circle of radical pietists. And this circle of radical pietists had themselves come crossways with the Bernese government and so on at various points. But they were well-to-do men, bankers and merchants and so on like that. So they had some economic power and as well as family connections there. And it gave them a somewhat protected, maybe marginal, still somewhat marginal place there in Bern. And they weren't concerned. And the Dutch Mennonites decided in January of 1715 to petition the Dutch State General, the government of the Netherlands, to intercede with the Bern Council on behalf of the galley prisoners. And the States General, and remember, the Netherlands, the main church, the public church is reformed. The States General, most of the people in there are reformed, but it's a different mentality. It's a different kind of attitude. And they write to, they ask them, will you please intercede with the Bernese government for our co-religionists in the Netherlands. And this is what, and they do, and they write to the Bernese government. And they said, considering the behavior of the Mennonites, are baptism-minded who live in our state, who are submissive and obedient to the government in matters which are not contrary to God's holy word, according to their persuasion, who bear love to one another and are peaceful in society, and basing our view of the behavior of their fellow believers in your canton in this, we cannot but have pity for these poor people who are being severely punished purely because they attempt to serve God with a good conscience, according to their understanding of his will from his holy word, on which they base their faith. Inasmuch as they err in their understanding, they are far more worthy of compassion than meriting severe persecution, in particular from you, who are the same persuasion as we in that faith is a gift of God, who has reserved to himself alone the judgment over human consciences. In the meantime, the Dutch Committee for Foreign Needs arranges for funds to be transferred to Turn for the maintenance of the prisoners. Runkel, representing the Dutch Committee, also attempts to intercede with the Bern Council. In March 1715, the council replies to both the Estates General and to Runkel, and while the Bern Council did not rescind any of their policies, particularly in relation to the Swiss brethren still incarcerated in Bern, they did indicate they would not stand in the way of the Dutch Mennonites working for the release of the galley prisoners in Turin, if they could guarantee the prisoners would not return to Bern. That was the place they would not budge on. Then we have this new person entering on the scene. In October 1715, Nicholas Samuel de Tretorens, a native of Neuchâtel, part of the French-speaking Switzerland, a radical pietist with connections to the Schwarzenau Brethren, arrives in Bern. He had been asked by Christian Liebe's mother to intercede with the authorities on the behalf of her son. There he became aware of the plight of the other galley prisoners, as well as 40 other Swiss brethren imprisoned in Bern. There he learned that the King of Sicily was willing to release the prisoners for a price if the Bern government agreed. He wrote about his findings to Huysen Hoya, a Mennonite minister at Krefeld, who had contacts with the Committee for Foreign Needs. Tretorens thought the Bern Council would also release the 40 prisoners they had if they promised to leave the canton and not come back. He suggested that the committee work with Daniel Knopf, and that's Daniel Knopf, a Bern banker and radical pietist, to work out the arrangements. And Daniel Knopf played a very vital role as a middleman between the Dutch Committee for Foreign Needs and the Bernese government, and also the authorities in Turin. On November 1st, the Bernese Anabaptist Commission wrote to Colonel Hackbrett in turn that it had approved the release of the prisoners if they promised not to return to Bern. Meanwhile, Tretorens' activities had attracted the attention of the Bern authorities. He was brought in for questioning and was briefly incarcerated. After he was released, he was able to visit the 40 Anabaptists imprisoned and burned. In 1717, he wrote this Lettre Missia in French, and it's addressed to the Bernese Council, and it's an argument. He's trying to persuade them that they should tolerate both radical pietists and the Täufer, the Swiss Brethren. And there's the third part of it. This is you'll see the main title page, and then this is a title page of the third part of it. And the third part of it, he gives an account of a visit he paid late in 1715 to these 40 Anabaptists. And that is included as an appendix in the third volume. That account is included as an appendix in the third volume. I want to read you this account. At that same time, having been able by the assistance of a friend to enter the prison, where all these poor Anabaptists are shut in, I found upon entering a large room about 40 persons, as many men and women as girls, all sitting pell-mell on long benches, almost as children at school, all working with wool according to the task assigned to them. As soon as I saw them, this first thought came to me. If their excellencies, and that's how he addresses the Bernese authorities, if their excellencies did not know that these people are people of goodness and chastity, they would not have left them, as one may say, day and night, the one among the other, without fear of disorder, since carnal persons could not keep themselves from often falling into impurity if they were found in equal conditions. I saw there, among others, a truly old man, all white and stooped with age, who told me he had passed 80 years of age. This man still worked at his task of carding wool with such a calmness that it seemed to me that I was observing one of the ancient patriarchs of antiquity. They showed me their portion of black bread that was daily given to each of them, while telling me that most of the men who worked did not have enough to satisfy their needs, but rather that many women did not eat all their portions, giving them their leftovers in order to supply them, and thus they might still live. As I observed in the middle of the room a woman on her knees who was nursing her child in the cradle on the ground, and as I approached her, I asked if her husband was there. No, she told me. And at the same time, the tears began to flow from her eyes and to water the cheeks of her little child. I asked her why she was weeping. She said to me, "Sir, it is even because of my husband who died just a little while ago. When they captured us," she continued, "I was with child by my husband who was on his deathbed. We begged the court and the hunters, even by giving money to the latter. So in the end, they consented that my husband could die in his bed, seeing clearly that he could not again escape. But as for me, I could never be permitted to remain beside him, so that I might render my last duties and comforts. Thus they brought me here, where soon after I brought forth the child which you see. And as the sickness of my husband of a year's duration had brought us to this point, and finally perceiving that his death approached, he made supplication to the court to grant him the favor of being able to see me one more time before he died, especially his child, which he had never before seen, but was not able to obtain this favor. Yet the hunters," she said, "have taken from us almost all that remained as payment for their capture. It is true that for my children, I have hope in God that he will provide, putting them all entirely into the hands of his providence. I confess, my Lord, that this disclosure, along with the tears of this woman, moved my heart almost to the point of casting myself down in tears, unable to marvel sufficiently at the great hardness that is used toward these poor people who refuse to consent to what is asked them only by the sole fear that they have of thereby offending their Lord, even as their excellencies know." Shortly afterwards, Territorians returned to his home at Neuchâtel, where he waited for Daniel Knopf to send him the documents from the Bern authorities to present the King of Sicily at Turin. Meanwhile, the 4 remaining galley prisoners have been transferred to Sicily. I'll just go back and show you the map here. We start up in Switzerland, they go to Turin, and they go down probably to Nice, the port of Nice, and then go down to Palermo there in Sicily, all right? And so in the by November of 1715, they're down at the port of Palermo, where one of their number died. Hans Luthi died after they arrived in Palermo. So now there are only 3 of them still there. Christian Liebe, Peter Ruthrick, and Joseph Probst wrote to Daniel Knopf, indicating that they were willing to accept the condition not to return to Bern. And Daniel Knopf passed the letter to the Dutch Committee for Foreign Needs, and that's why we have it today. All right. In December 1717, with documents in hand, de Territorens traveled to Turin, where he worked through Colonel Hackbrett to negotiate the release of the prisoners. In January 1716, the Savoyan court agreed to the request with the understanding that it would be reimbursed for what they had paid Bern for the prisoners. Daniel Knopf acted as a middleman between them and between the Committee for Foreign Needs and Savoy. The transfer of funds and winter sea conditions delayed the release. In May 1716, they arrived in Nice, which, and again, I'll go back to the map there, you can see. And then they were to go to Turin for final disposition. De Territorens got them, they arrived off the ship, still in chains, and de Territorens got their chains taken off. He had brought clothes for them, he brought food for them, and he saw them safely to Turin, where he met with Colonel Hackbrett. And then he went through Savoy, went to Geneva, went around the northwestern part of Switzerland up to Neuchâtel, because they couldn't go through Bern. All right. And at Neuchâtel, Christian Liebe left and went up to the Palatinate, and Joseph Probst and Peter Ruthrick went to the bishopric of Basel, where there was a small Swiss Brethren congregation. How much time do I have? I have 5 minutes. Well, survive on the Palatinate in 5 minutes. Okay. All right. This is, I would say that this whole story about there in Bern with these galley prisoners is one of my favorite parts of this book. All right. Okay. As probably many of you know, I'm going to look here at very quickly at the electoral constriction of Mennonite privileges in 1740s. Okay. As probably many of you know, in the 1650s, the Swiss Brethren from Zurich moved into the Rhineland. It's due to a very repressive persecution that is documented in volume 1 of Documents of Brotherly Love. In the 1670s, and the Canton of Zurich successfully eliminated Anabaptism from its borders. In 1671, the Swiss Brethren from Bern, some Swiss Brethren from Bern moved into the Rhineland, again as a result of persecution. And then, of course, in 1710 and 1711, we have these 4 barges of Swiss Brethren, exiles from Bern, released into the Rhineland. And so this is on the folks who are coming in the 1650s is on the cusp at the end of the 30 Years' War. The Rhineland is the battleground of that war. The Palatinate is devastated. The population is also, I mean, many people just simply died from famine and everything as a result of the war. And the nobility of the nobility in the Palatinate needed people to farm their farms. And at the same time, from understanding, in Switzerland, there's actually a population surge there. Switzerland can't contain everybody, and you have this migration of Swiss into the Rhineland. Not only Teuf or Swiss Brethren, but Swiss in general. But along with this, a minority of these folks are Swiss Brethren. So, and they are given places there. Nobility give them hulsts and farms and so on to rebuild. And in 1664, Karl Ludwig, the elector of the Palatinate, grants a concession to these people. And it's a very interesting concession. I have the text here, but I'm not going to read it to you. It is in both volume 2 and volume 3 of Documents of Brotherly Love. No, excuse me, volume 1 and volume 3 of Documents of Brotherly Love. But one of the things that's very interesting is, of course, is that the Palatinate was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and there was a Wiedertäufer or Anabaptists were prohibited in the Holy Roman Empire. And Karl Ludwig got around that by calling them Mennonites. So a very interesting dissertation just recently out by Corey Davis on this whole thing. I only started reading it, but he makes a very interesting point, of course, is that the elector and this nobility were not motivated by any sense of justice or toleration or consideration. They just needed people to farm their land, and so they were going to put up with these folks who were going to do it. And that's the very summit. But to get around this Wiedertäufer Anabaptist designation, he called them Mennonites. He called them Mennonites, and that's a very interesting thing. And so he gave them this. He gave them this concession. They had to pay an annual special tax of 6 guilders per head every year. They also had to pay 3 guilders for militia tax and so on. And they had to promise to refrain from rebaptism. Now, of course, their own children were not baptized. And I always wonder how they thought about that, because, you know, the traditional argument of Anabaptism is that infant baptism is no baptism, and they rejected the idea that they were Anabaptists. The early Anabaptists, and even in this period of time, never called themselves Anabaptists. That's something that only happens in the 20th century, and I think it's a very problematic term myself. I don't like it, but, you know, sometimes you're stuck with it. All right. Okay. The next 3 electors reaffirmed this concession, but Carl Philip, Elector Carl Philip, serving from who was elector from 1716 to 1742, even though he granted the concession in 1717. In the 1720s, he issues a proclamation that says that if an Anabaptist buys property, the original holders of the property, you know, and it's interesting, the term in this particular case, and all these proclamations in the 1720s and 30s coming from the electorate, they no longer use the language Mennonite to identify these people. They call them Wiedertäufer, Anabaptist. Again, kind of asserting the illegal status of these folks here. And he says they can, you know, if they buy land from somebody in the term, and the other people they refer to as Christians. So you have Wiedertäufer and Christians being in the idea of the and by the way, by this time, Karl Ludwig was reformed, but his successors, he had no direct descendants. His successors were Roman Catholic. It passed to a Roman Catholic branch of the electoral family. But that really doesn't seem to have been an issue, because there's a number of, there's a monastery that owns, an abbey that owns land that Mennonites are farming, and they're really happy. The monks are really happy to have them there farming that oak. So it isn't. And Corey Davis brings out the point that it was these middle nobility and bureaucrats and other officials who kind of stood, who, when things began to change and so on, who sort of stood there as middleman between the Anabaptist and the electoral government. And that's certainly the case here in the 1740s. All right. In the 1740s, in a sense, the Mennonites in the Palatinate become victims of their own success because they are growing. I'll just turn back here. All right, 1664, 91 households, 1685, 185 households, 1710, 182 households. Now that's during the time when about 300 households migrate to North America. Okay, and 1724, 155 households. And then in 17, these are all based on censuses taken by the electoral government for the purpose of taxing, knowing how many people to tax in the Anabaptist or Mennonite households class. 1738, 214 households, 1749, 43, 294 households, and in 1750, around 251 households. Now, in 1731 and 32, the Dutch Mennonites write to the folks in the Platinum, leaders of the Platinum, said, well, we actually would like to know the number of congregations and the church leaders and how many households there are. And so they send, there's two documents, one from the Upper Platinate, one from the Lower Platinate, that gives this account. And there you'll notice they're saying the Upper Platinate, there are 160 households, in the Lower Platinate, there are 336 households. We can see that there's sort of an underreporting here. Wonder what is happening there. Okay, but in 1740, Carl Philipp issues another directive which says he wants to raise the tax to 12 guilders, from 6 to 12 guilders, and he wants to reduce the number of Anabaptist households. He wants to get them down to about 200. Okay, and he does that by saying, okay, if young people grow up, they have to leave, and get married, they have to leave. I'm not giving you any more hosts. They can't have any more land. They have to leave. All right. And this causes a big hardship. And it is probably not only the only thing, but it's probably one of the things that prompts migration to North America. Okay. And that's something that could actually be tracked a little bit more. Though I should just mention, it's estimated, I think, that around 4,000 Mennonites migrated to North America in the 18th century, about 500 Amish, and there's about 80,000 Germans who come into the port of Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia during that same period of time. And they're doing the same, because there's not only just, there are a lot of economic upheavals in the Platinum due to wars, because again, the Rhineland is a battleground and so on, that pushes a lot of people, not just Mennonites, out of the Platinum into North America. The Dutch Mennonites did not want to encourage that. In fact, they're very clear, maybe Lydia will talk a little bit more about that, is they wanted them to stay in the Platinum and let us help you in the Platinum. And they basically said, if you come, if poor Palatine Mennonites come to Amsterdam and Rotterdam, we are not going to pay their passage to North America. We're not going to do it. Now, the reality is, and they wrote to the Platinum ministers many times and say, tell your people that we're not going to do it. And the Platinum minister said, we will tell them, we will tell them, we will tell them, but we can't stop them from coming. All right. And there are a couple of different cases, these soft-hearted Dutch Mennonites who said, no, we are not going to pay for their passage. They get a party, landed there in Rotterdam, have nothing. They help them over. They pay for their passage and so on over. But it only happens a couple of times. As a consequence, because of that Dutch Mennonite policy, there is less in these documents than we might have hoped for about the migration to North America. Okay, I think I took more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Edsel. We've been sitting for quite a while, so let's take just a few minutes. I want to keep this a short break, though, but take some time to stand up and stretch, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes and hear from Lydia Penner about the translation project.
Well, it's nothing within any time, I guess. Here, okay, that's what.
I think you can also,
Okay, D.
you can also use it. You can use this one too.
Okay. And voltage, how do I get that?
I'm sorry.
Voltage.
Well, you want to see the whole thing? This is showing what's.
No, I mean, I mean, this one. Oh, I see, that's how it goes.
Yeah, and this is-
Here, it only appears.
They only see this, and then this tells you what's coming next as a reminder. And so you need to go down for next. This one goes next, or this one goes back. Okay. No, there's no, that's what I was just gonna say, no, there's no. We looked.
So there's no.
Yeah. No, we had.
We'll have all of us folks and provide everything and then okay. Well, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You may be aware of Alan Garber, who wrote a book about the Lancaster County immigrants. Book, entitled Book to Babylonian Honor. My brothers. And now I.
I don't know all the I think I'm
All right, if I could ask everyone to find seats again, we want to move on to our next topic. If I could ask everyone to please find your seats so we can move on to our next topic, please. I think some folks are coming in from the lobby, and we're going to. Okay. Okay. If I could, think folks are coming in. All right. As we continue this afternoon, I'd like to introduce Lydia Penner. Lydia Penner was born and raised on a farm near Steinbach, Manitoba, in a household that was part of the Quartitza Mennonite Conference. She has spent much of her adult life in Europe and has worked in a variety of occupations. As a journalist and as a translator and in the church. She is a retired minister in the Dutch Mennonite Conference. She speaks several languages and is a certified translator and is the co-editor and principal translator of Volume 3 of Documents of Brotherly Love. She's now presenting on the challenges of translation, 18th century Dutch and German into modern American English.
Hello, friends. I'm glad to see you here because of all the work I've done, this was the most enjoyable I ever did, even though I nearly fried my brains on it from time to time. And I'm so enthusiastic about it. I love to talk about it. So I'm very glad there are people interested in hearing about it. But before I begin on my subject, I want to explain my accent, because my experience in the Netherlands is that people who hear me for the first time are distracted by trying to figure out where my accent comes from. And is that German they are detecting, or English? Or is it a dialect of Southern Netherlands where they speak a soft K instead of the harder K of the North? My first language was Plautisch, a West Prussian Low German dialect, which the Mennonites took with them from Prussia to Russia, and then from there to the rest of the world, including Canada, where I grew up. And then I learned English in school in Canada, and that became my mother tongue. But Plautisch has continued to influence my speech. And for the last 42 years, Dutch has been my language of speech. And so you are hearing that influence as well. My focus in this talk will be on Volume 3. And I will begin with a few general remarks on translation, then go on to more specific issues in this volume. The first principle of translation is that the translated document has to read as if it was written in the original language, as if this translation is the original language. In this case, it's American English, as distinguished from British English, which is used in Europe. It's not moving. Okay. And then on the screen, you see a few examples of differences. And sometimes I slip up, reverting to Canadian English, which is a mixture of British and American English. The principle is to translate literally, if possible. But if a literal translation does not render good English, you have to apply other strategies, and these can be quite radical, even to the point of editing the original while conveying the meaning in correct English. Since there was no standard spelling, punctuation, or grammar in the 18th century, and some writers in these texts had only a basic education, a great deal of editing was involved to allow sensible English to emerge. Another important thing in translation is to establish the target audience. Who will be reading this book? Is it for a general audience or a more specific one? It seemed to me that the people most interested in this primary source, besides the Amish and Mennonites who have sponsored the book, would be American scholars of Mennonite history, but also of other history and even of other fields, as the book has something to say on a wide range of topics. For such purposes, it is particularly important that the language of translation be clear, giving no rise to misinterpretation, for the texts will likely be quoted in other works. And if you have an unclear English translation, then many errors of fact can be made. Yet the book could also be an interesting read for people who are not scholars, because it includes some exciting stories and often deals with issues relevant to our time. My conclusion was that the writing style had to be readable and accessible for a wide, general, modern readership. However, following the example of James Lowry, some 18th century features have been retained, though usually translated into English. For instance, the salutations in the letters include a variety of adjectives such as worthy, respected, honored, beloved, etc., according to the relationship with the person being written to. Now, if I were to translate in wholly modern English, we would simply write, "Dear Sir" or "Madam," or the name of the person we are addressing. And letters were often of a formulaic nature. For instance, certain subjects and phrases in openings and closings, particularly in personal letters, that there might be a reference to health issues or best wishes in the salutation or opening. I tried to retain a formulaic character in the openings and closings using English models such as the King James Bible for greetings and examples of letters on the internet for the closings. Oops, it's gone too far. There. There are examples from semi-personal letters on the screen, and you have a few moments to read them. A good example of a specific case of an 18th century flavor is the title for the members of the Dutch Parliament, Hare hoogmogende heren der Staten-Generaal. No dictionary I consulted provides an English translation. It only says it is a former title for members of the Dutch Parliament. Now, the last word can be translated literally as States General, the official English name of the Dutch Parliament to this day. I should point out that states are not political entities as states here in the United States, but originally referred to estates, the social categories in the society of the day, such as the nobility, the clergy, and the professionals, which of course we don't follow it at this time. Now, heren can be translated either lords or gentlemen, and lords is preferable here because public leaders in the European context were often referred to as lords, even if they did not have land or were not aristocrats. The hitch comes with that hoogmogende. The literal translation of hoog is high, and mogend means being able to do something. But I found translations in 18th century documents on the internet. In the British Gentleman's Magazine of the 18th century, I found their high and mighty lords as translation. A contemporary English translation in volume 2 also translates their high mightinesses. And since this is the one I came across in colonial American documents, I'll use it in volume 3 because it's an American book. In a book where a wholly modern translation would be preferred, you would use the modern term, and in this case, the title would read, The Honorable Members of the States General. Legal terms are always tricky. The legal systems of the countries mentioned in these documents are different. There are different titles for public officials. For instance, the German word Schultheiß refers to someone who is both administrator and judge. The term magistrate in the European sense implies both these functions. Another tricky thing is words translators call false friends. They sound like a word in the target language, but have a different meaning. An example from the present project is the word insinuatie, used both in Dutch and in German, but pronounced slightly differently. This sounds like the English insinuation, which means a hint or an innuendo. However, in the book, it is used in a legal context, meaning bailiff's notification in British English and process server's notice in American English. Now, I made a false friend mistake in volume 2. This was when I was still an amateur in translating and knew absolutely nothing of the background of these documents I was translating, nor did I have time to look up resources in the National Library as I did for volume 3, as I had my hands full with the ministry in The Hague. The word is gecommitteerde. This sounds like committee, which is how I usually translated it, whereas in many cases, it should have been translated delegates. And this translation, it's not a serious mistake, but it does make for confusion as to the nature of a meeting where the word is used. Is this a committee or is this a more general gathering? Now for some translation complications more specific to this project. The first one is, how do you translate the terms used in other countries for what here falls under the generic term Mennonite? Is it legitimate simply to use the American name? Now on the screen you see the various names. The blue are the Dutch because they consider blue their color. And the green are the Swiss in Switzerland, the Palatinate, and Pennsylvania. Now let me begin with the Netherlands, since the name Mennonite is derived from the first name of the Dutch reformer Menno Simons. The present Dutch fellow believers all refer to themselves as doopsgezinden, a title that first appeared in writing in 1564. It literally means baptism-minded. The Dutch don't really want to be referred to as Mennonites in English language texts, even though they are members of the Mennonite World Conference. The most important of several reasons is that they associate the name doopsgezind with their unique history among the descendants of the Anabaptists, which they cherish. They have lived as a divergent minority in the Netherlands for nearly 500 years. There they have survived persecution, repression, pressure from the public Reformed Church to abandon their divergent ideas on what it means to be a Christian, and internal quarrels and splits. They have embraced the Enlightenment, higher education, and individual freedom to relate to God according to one's own conscience, while maintaining community in the local congregation and in the general society or conference to which all the congregations at present belong. Now, to accommodate this sensitivity, we have translated doopsgezinden as baptism-minded, the literal translation. I'm not wholly happy with this term because it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't point specifically to the Dutch descendants of the Anabaptists. But I don't know how to resolve this dilemma. The Dutch prefer that doopsgezinden be retained in English texts, and that is a legitimate translation strategy, but this can be alienated for English speakers who do not know how to pronounce it. In fact, the Dutch terms Mennonist and Mennist and variants thereof, derived from Menno, were used side by side with doopsgezinden in the Netherlands until the 19th century. The traditional or so-called conservative congregations who continued to adhere quite strictly to the teachings of Menno Simons did refer to themselves as Mennonist or Mennist. And now the Swiss, they're called by different names in these documents, but mostly Täuferleute, literally baptizing people, or Täufer, baptizers. Now this is a term that could apply to all Christians. The Swiss fellow believers were divided into two groups from 1693, the followers of Jacob Ammon, the Amish, and the followers of Hans Rijst, the Rijstians. To cover both these groups, I decided to follow James Lowry in referring to them as Anabaptists. This term in our time no longer has the connotation of its early meaning. People who, baptized as a baby, were again baptized as an adult. Also, there are members of the Mennonite World Conference who prefer the term Anabaptist to Mennonite, in that way avoiding association with the trappings of language and culture of the older conferences. It was not until the 19th century that the Swiss Anabaptists began calling themselves Mennoniten, the German name, followed by Alttäufer, Old Anabaptists in brackets. However, Johannes Ludwig Runkel, who was already mentioned, a diplomat for the States General who negotiated options for the relief of the persecuted Swiss friends in the 18th century, most often referred to them as Mennoniten. Now, the easiest to translate was the name the Palatine fellow believers gave themselves, Mennonisten. And Edsel has already told about the Prince Elector who formally invited Swiss Anabaptists to settle there in 1664, and he referred to them as such. And this name was no doubt used instead of Wiedertäufer, Anabaptists, to avoid having to arrest them. This was according to the decision by the Imperial Diet in 1570. Also, in the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, Anabaptism was specifically excluded from acceptance as a religion. The irony is that the term Mennonist or Mennonist for the Anabaptists was first used by officials in the Netherlands and Germany. In the tolerant Emden in northern Germany, it was used in 1545 by the ruler there. And during the course of their correspondence with the Dutch Doopsgezinden, the Palatine leaders sometimes adopted the Dutch name, either in its Dutch form or in the German translation Taufgezinten. And this name already appears in the German concept of Cologne in 1591. Now, you can hear this is evident that you need to have some background knowledge to be able to translate terms such as this in their context. You can't just take a literal translation. For example, Dutch dictionaries translate Doopsgezinden as Baptists. So if I were to use the dictionary, then I would not have a translation that would be understandable in the context of Mennonites. Another related problem that caused some of that brain frying I mentioned at the beginning was the translation of the titles of church leaders of the different countries and denominations. The Dutch had the leadership structure of elder or bishop called oudste, preacher or minister called leraar, and deacons. And this is the structure I grew up with in our church in Canada. And the names for these functions and the functions themselves changed over time. The oudsten were called opzieners, overseers, a biblical word for the function of bishop. And eventually, the ministers in some congregations were called overseers because they were performing the tasks of bishops, baptizing, serving communion, ordaining colleague ministers, performing marriages, and resolving disputes. A word used in all the groups, the Dutch, the Swiss, the Palatines, other Germans, and the settlers of Pennsylvania, was diener, or dienaar in Dutch. This literally means servant. But did this refer to the ministers or to the deacons or to them collectively? The Swiss and Palatines did not originally use the German word älteste, Dutch oudste, for the elder or bishop. They called him bestätigde diener, confirmed or full minister. But in these letters, the Palatines used the term älteste, a dialect form of the German Älteste. James Lowry translated Älteste as elder, but sometimes it sounded to me as if the deacon was meant. The information on titles of leaders I gleaned from Mennonite history books and articles on the subject did not always apply to the specific situations reflected in the letters of the documents of brotherly love. I got so confused that I decided to make up a chart listing the number and date of a document, the writer, the recipient, the term used, and in which context, and a possible translation to establish a pattern. And after 50 documents, I thought I had one. It was eventually decided by the committee that a chart should be made up for all the documents as an appendix. Now, Edsel Burdge, the editor on the American side, refined it. And so this chart is probably the best overview there is of the titles of Anabaptists, Mennonites, Amish, and Doopsgezinde in the 18th century. But like everything in historical writings, it should not be taken as incontrovertible truth because new insights could always arise. And some of the translations do not entirely cover all the nuances of the function. Another issue, though less confusing, was the spelling of personal names. In the 18th century, there were no standard spellings for names, and very few people always spelled their name in the same way. The committee asked me to use modern names. I thought they meant American names, but I thought it incongruous to have an American name in a Swiss, German, French, or Dutch context, unless, of course, the reference is to historical figures, which are normally spelled according to the language of the text in which they appear. Now, I compromised by using the modern name in the country the person referred to was living in. So one person could have several names. When he was in Switzerland, it'd be a Schurg, and when he was in the Netherlands, it'd be Schur, and in America, it's Schurk. Now, I had various sources for this, and variants, including North American spellings, are given in the footnotes, so you can recognize your own name in these foreign names, because the footnotes tell you what it is. An issue I struggled with was the designation of a currency indicated with the capital letter R. The transcribers filled this in with Reichstaler in German or Rijksdalder in Dutch, translated as Riksdollar. This Reichstaler, a silver coin, was the main currency in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. The main Dutch coin was the gulden or guilder, also referred to as the florin, a gold coin minted in Florence from the 14th century. What puzzled me about the R was that in the text, the Palatines wrote 50 R, that is 50 gulden. So how could that be? Because there were 2.5 Dutch guilders in a Riksdollar at the time. And then I stumbled on the Rennersgulden, a gold coin in wide circulation in the 14th and 15th centuries, but then replaced by the thaler. The Rennersgulden came into use again later in southern Germany, but as a silver coin, and then everything made sense. This R was the Rennersgulden, worth 1.5 Dutch guilders, and now the accounts, the Palatines, the accounts from the Palatines using the R to designate the currency added up. This meant that I had to change all the transcriptions and translations accordingly. And very likely I overlooked some, So if you see a Riksdaler as a translation for the capital R, it is a mistake. Now, as a theologian, I was very interested in the Bible texts being quoted. And I looked up all the quotes and paraphrases in Bibles that might be the source. And if a direct quotation was concerned, I used the translation of the King James Bible of 1651, as it fits the style of the Bibles used in the 18th century better than the more recent translations. But if I were to be wholly modern in my translations, I would use the New International Version in the American context. Mennonites even participated in the translation. And paraphrases were translated in my own words. No, not the most quoted verse in volume 3 is Matthew 5, verse 7. And so on the screen, I show 7 of the languages and dialects used by the people populating these volumes. English, German, Dutch, French, Frisian, Pennsylvania Dutch, and Plautdietsch. And the Plautdietsch is in there because the Prussian Mennonites are mentioned, as well as Swiss and Palatine Mennonites. Finally, I want to discuss 2 more or less untranslatable words. The first one is from the Hebrew Bible, chesed. It means something like solidarity, wholly identifying with someone. The British theologian Norman H. Smythe, in a book on distinctive ideas of the Old Testament, refers to it as covenant love. The translation of the Staten-Vertaling, the Bible of the States General of 1637, and those of the King James Bible in 1651, invented a new word for it. The English was loving kindness, the Dutch goedertierenheid. Now, this word is actually used by one of the larger congregations of Amsterdam in a letter to the fledgling congregation of Germantown. The most recent translations have words like love, grace, mercy, kindness, compassion, which I said, because of course, love and kindness is not understood by the present generation. But none of these words actually cover the meaning by themselves. Another untranslatable word I want to mention is one from our own tradition, the German word Gelassenheit. My German-English dictionary says it means self-possession, calmness, composure, resignation, even temper, patience, deliberateness. However, in the Anabaptist context, the word has a deeper connotation, as you here know, I would think. The Mennonite Encyclopedia uses up 3 columns explaining it, and Donald Kraybill devotes a whole chapter to explaining it in his book, The Riddle of Amish Culture. It means, among other things, giving yourself up to God's will, including the readiness to suffer for the sake of God. It means self-surrender and also peace and calmness of mind. The best translation strategy for a word like this is to let it stand in the original language and explain it briefly. But you can really only grasp its full meaning if you live in a culture of Gelassenheit. We see here that the language of a people reflects their culture and mindset. And that is why languages are so fascinating for me. They open up a new world. They open my mind and hearts to people with a different mindset, all of them created by God in his image, as I am. Thank you for listening so attentively.
Well, thanks to our three presenters, and I'll now ask them to come forward. I'll grab a third chair and ask them to sit here, although because we are recording this and need to use the microphone, as questions come, I'll have to ask each of the three of you to then come to Edsel and John and Lydia, if you'll When a question is directed to you, I'll ask you to come here to the microphone to answer or to address the issue being asked. I might also mention, since Lydia mentioned the chart about leaders, the names for leaders, that was published in Pennsylvania Mennonite Heritage, I believe. Carol, what was it, 2 years ago? Something like that, about 2 years ago. So Pennsylvania Mennonite Heritage, that journal that hope you're all familiar with, that a chart on leaders' titles and translation appeared there. So thanks to all of you. And what questions? I'll stay here at first to repeat the question. Questions do you have? I'm going to be slow in getting started. I'll have to ask my question, I suppose, for both. Well, it could be for any of you, but question I was going to ask Lydia, what was you mentioned at first not being familiar with the sources and stories before. What was the biggest surprise to you in this project? But Edsel, you probably have surprises, and John as well.
Well, sorry. The biggest surprise was the hostility that the Bern government had for the Swiss, for the Anabaptists. I've never encountered that before, except in the Martyrs' Mirror. And there they didn't talk about the government, they just talk about the martyrs.
Not sure if this was a surprise so much as a realization. You know, the Swiss and Palatine Täufer had reasons to feel very ambivalent about the Dutch in their acculturation. And yet when they were desperate, they appealed. And something struck me when the trek of those 600 or 700 people from Bern up toward pass through Alsace into the Palatinate occurred. There was a man named Valentin Huitwol, and a young fellow named Johann Clemens went around with him, and later another person went with him, and they sent an appeal. They took a little survey of the situation, the people that came and what little they brought, and they're in their tears and family breakup and all, and they sent a description over, and it was read in Amsterdam. And then, you know, the Dutch were split. The Mennonites we're professional splitters. Amish, Mennonite, sub-Mennonite, Frisian and Flemish and so forth. We're pros at that. Anyway, here's a man from the Lauren and Torin and Lamb congregation, the liberals, writing over to the Zon, which are conservative, and saying, by the confession of faith and the nature of love, we've got to work together. And twice in the 1670s and later, and 1710, you had MCCs. They were forced by something in their spiritual DNA to work together, because there's a need in the confession of faith itself and the nature of love. Look it up. Now, one of them said to the, wrote to another Dutch, he said that those Germanic, Swiss and Palatine Teufer, they're suspicious of us. But he said, all that, given all that, it's our duty to do that. And they had something in common. And you know, we were kind of a miscellaneous group getting together here, a woman preacher here and a conservative, some Amish and some Mennonites, and we were sort of reenacting this experience. I don't know if that was a surprise or not, what you call it, what you want to, but you could feel that thing happening again. Would you agree with me on that, Amos? Not everybody is as genial as Amos.
I would echo John's point. And I would say that in working with the documents, I came to perhaps appreciate the Dutch Mennonites in the 18th century more than I would have been maybe inclined to before having worked with the documents. The thing that I was struck by is the continued spiritual power of the Swiss brethren in Switzerland and in the Palatinate, and their steadfastness and their ability to win converts from outside the family that were initially part of their communities. That was to me a very pleasant surprise, and one that I found breaking a myth that is often told among contemporary Mennonites here in North America as a trope to justify some rather interesting things. I would have to say that, and I think Lydia, I sense from communications with Lydia also, I'm sure with John, is that this was a scholarly endeavor, but it was also a spiritually inspiring endeavor. And that, I joined the Mennonite church at the age of 17 from a non-Mennonite background. And when I read Lucas Smith's description of the faith that he came to, it's the same faith that I came to at the age of 17. And that was a very powerful experience.
May I add something to that? You can hear this, right? Over here. You know, it's interesting that Edsel chose for his presentation here to dwell on some documents that aren't in the Scheffer archive at all. He sort of borrowed them from the Neuteufer, right? And that they'd been brought to the surface by, what's the great John Dernbaugh. But we got swept up into the story of and the notion of documents of brotherly love. That was the motif that got a hold of us. And then we pulled these other things in because they're about that, and it includes the same people, but we weren't just stuck on the Scheffer archive. And then here at the Muddy Creek Farm Library, there was a little sammelband. Amos wasn't sure quite where it came from. And it had a poem in it. At the end, it had B, B, B. Well, here's a poem right out of the Meistersinger tradition, written in a jail with chains on, and the Dutch would call him an oudster. He was forget which of the bestätigte Diener, I guess, Benedict Breckbill, who has a whole story there. And here we grew up without, that's central to our story. And we grew up without any reference to it. So we were not too industrious on those things. We settled the land that God gave us, that the Indians had, and we praised God with Amos Hurst's song about how wonderful it all was. There were things in our spiritual agenda that we didn't really concentrate on. And I think an encounter in this experience, it wonders me how many people will really pick this up, but there will be people, and there will be, nature throws up exceptional people that'll live with this.
Interpreters will pick it up. And it affects the whole community.
But isn't it a wonderful thought that here the stewardship of this elderly, committed Dutch professor blossoms all these years later? Isn't that a wonderful thought?
Any questions? Yes.
Feedback or input did you get from European Anabaptists along the way about the project you were working on?
Okay, what feedback or did you receive from European Anabaptists along the way? That okay.
Well, to my sorrow, in the Netherlands at least, very few people know about this except those people around. Piet Visser, the Mennonite historian, and some other people. So that's why I was very glad that a symposium was being held on this series, so that a video is going to be made of it, which maybe can be shown to my people back home and get them interested. And because 18th century, they are involved right now with the present time. And the other countries, I don't know.
Speak while John's looking for something. Well, of course, I think as John referred to, Hans-Peter Jecker has been a help in our project, been aware of it. He also wrote an endorsement for the last volume. So we sent him a PDF of it before it was published, printed. Piet Visser has reviewed the first two volumes in the Duplicazinde Bedragen, and a very positive review. Troy Osborne, who is a professor of history at Conrad Grebel and a specialist in Dutch Anabaptism, has used it. I think I mentioned Corey Davis, who is a newly minted PhD. He cites both the first and second volume in his dissertation. I remember when I was looking for the text of Nicholas Samuel de Traitorian's account about visiting the Swiss brethren in prison, that I had a PDF of that document and so on, but it just so happened that a few years ago, Robert Bacher, who is connected with the French Mennonite historical organization, has done a lot of research and writing over the years, actually published that, he transcribed and published that excerpt, and we used his transcription as a readily accessed thing. And when I wrote to him asking permission to use that, he said yes. And when your book comes out, I want a copy. Yeah, I want a copy. Yeah, and so I think that of course, if you're in the Netherlands or you're in Germany, where, I mean, the languages that are there, I mean, it's like for us, you know, as 21st century Americans reading 18th century English, it's a little different, but we still can work with it. It's still our language. There may be some archaic things and so on. People who speak Dutch and German in Europe the translations probably aren't going to be that helpful to them, but the original sources are all of a sudden readily available to them. So I expect that it will get some use even among German and Dutch scholars who are interested. And another thing is Rosalind Byler, who is professor of history at the Central Florida University, has launched a major project called PRINT, which has to do with people, information, I forget what it's the acronym, but anyhow, she's very much interested in the interactions of people in the British Isles, in the Low Countries, in the Rhineland, and in Switzerland, and the migration to North America, and that all the networks and so on. And she has used these things and actually asked the committee a year or so ago for permission to use some of the documents on her website, and we gave her permission to use that. But that's part of a larger thing. So I think it will find a wider use as it becomes available. And I think I would just say that this volume, in my mind, is the most interesting volume. There's a lot of narrative. And a lot of sources coming from the Swiss brethren in Switzerland and from the Palatinate. Whereas some of the earlier volumes, there's a lot more of the documents tend to be from people helping them or opposed to them and so on. But this volume has a lot more, in a sense. The Pennsylvania background Mennonites, what their heritage and background is. It reflects more of it has more of their voice. And in fact, a few of the committee members who speak Pennsylvania Dutch, when they were looking at those letters from the Palatinate, they said, well, this is our language. And I think there's a connection there. John?
On these topics, let me read a page or two yet that I didn't that are right on this subject. I remember one time talking to Pete Fisser, who is not himself a Mennonite, a member. I mean, there are fewer and fewer groups over the recent half century, right? And but he's a sophisticated, legitimate scholar at the University of Amsterdam. And in my naivete, I said, why didn't you, this naive committee from over here, I said, why didn't you Dutch scholars do this? Well, he said it was too big. Well, that made me think for a while. And I'm not sure how to interpret it. But 23, 24. I have the wrong pages here, but let me read a little bit here. Fisser confessed to Jekker, Hans-Peter Jekker, the Dutch to this Swiss scholar, writing to him, it somehow crossed my desk. He was fond of the unacademically sponsored American project, and that he had found 2 expert Dutch scholars for the continuing task of transcription. Amazingly, with fraternal interest like that of their Doopskisend ancestry, both Bert Dopp and Wilhelm Struve, that Fisher said, I know about them. They'll help you. At the time when James Lowry, after strenuous decades of work, was was hoping to find some more chance to work on his original project. We asked Bert Fisher, would you help us? He said, no. He said, I can't, but I know of two people that will. And amazingly, those two men were not only willing to contribute their expertise, but to do so without remuneration. All they wanted were good photocopies to work from, viewable on compact discs, as arranged for by committee member Carolyn Charles Winger. Preparing for the series' next volume, that is volume 2, researcher Lowry and the committee were facing an imposingly large sequence, many of them sizable, and in the torturous rhetoric of diplomat Runkle. Even limiting the scope of that volume to the 2 years, 17, the big fat, 2 years, 17, 10, and 11, would produce a much larger book than that for the 74 years in volume 1. 74 and 2 years. Here we are, after 10 years or more, we're working on this thing and we're faced with this dilemma. So the committee discussed producing a smaller volume that would only cover 1710 in order to have the book out within 4 years. But that option wasn't taken then. And then, as the 300th anniversary of the events of 1710 approached, there was a spate of historical publications appearing. The year 210 brought forth Donald Crable's decade-long germinating concise history of Amish Brethren, Hutterites, and Mennonites. And the Amish from Ohio or Aylmer got John Gingrich to translate the finally Ernst Miller's 1895 book into English. At one time, Amos Hoover was in a committee talking about getting that done with Saul Yoder of Amsterdam. And when we talked it over with Amos, are you going to go ahead? Well, he said, we were going to work on this. We've been at it for a while. And we asked how much he had to show for it. He said, well, they had a half a page. Well, now, Pete Fisher wrote to Yecker that this committee stole my heart way back. There ought to be some joint venture of the true amateurs over in America and us so-called scholars. The resulting collaboration gifted volume 2, the big thick one, with Yecker's expert correction of the spellings of many Swiss family names that the Dutch had sort of mangled. And Yecker could rescue them back by helping us to get ready to get this thing out, going through the, getting all the names spelled right. Well, that was a big blessing for us, but it turned out to be a blessing for him because he got a better grasp on his material. And so Pete Fisher in the Netherlands and Yecker in Basel brought their expertise into this, and the grunt work was done over here. But then, but though they could now share documents digitally with a transatlantic immediacy, the amount of the correspondence that had to go into this big thick book remaining was daunting. At that stage, 4 women made significant contributions. There were 15 transcriptions, actually for volume 3, by Anna Volstra at the University of Amsterdam. And then There were, for the translation of some French letters, James Lowry found fellow classicist and writer acquaintance Neil and Stuckey Levine. What a name. Of Princeton, New Jersey. And then Anne Augsburger Schmidt-Lange of Longhorn, Pennsylvania. She was planning to do some family research in Bern and so on. And then for a larger role, though, as James pointed in another direction, Professor Fisser suggested the name of a Canadian-born, fluent, Dutch-speaking woman serving as minister in a Mennonite congregation at The Hague. This was Lydia Penner, a native of Western Canada. She proved to be a find, with both Lowry and myself meeting her in Amsterdam in 2011 and being favorably impressed by her evident interest in the project. Though she had limited time, she willingly tried her hand at the project, and by the following spring had translated 12 of the 83 documents, and James Lowry said, it's good work.
I would invite three speakers today to remain here just a little longer for those of you who have additional questions to come up and engage them individually. But I'd like to warmly invite all of you to return here at 7 p.m. this evening to hear Lydia Penner's KREIDER lecture, Dilemmas of Generosity, Dutch Mennonite Aid to Fellow Believers, which also draws on the documents in Volume 3. Dutch Mennonites, as we've heard, were moved by compassion and generosity to assist their fellow believers in Switzerland and the Palatinate, and they pursued various means to help them. And yet, when the demand became too great and the flow of immigrants through Rotterdam became too great, they sometimes felt they had to limit their generosity. That story from that time has not only historical value, but perhaps raises questions for our own contemporary situation in which so many millions of refugees are currently seeking safety around the world. So please come back at 7 p.m. this evening for that presentation by Lydia Penner. And once again, thank you to our speakers.
I'd like to say something, if I may.
Okay, we'll have the final word from John.
Well, not the final word, but here at an occasion like this with a very impressive audience, thank you so much for caring about this. Some people, God will give them all the credit they need, but I almost feel you have to recognize something here. There were people, the Kurtzes, for instance, with their initial interest, they got nothing out of the Kurtz family thing, but they stuck with it. At certain key points, I would think the Consul Harold Kurtz, the financial support. I wonder if Ed Klein, if hadn't been connecting us with the Amish AME press in Ohio, if the project would have gone through like it did. Or Caroline Wenger, faithfully connecting us back with that original Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society. She died before we could finish the project at Fairmount. She died, Carolyn Charles Wenger. There would be other people who should get credit too. My old roommate, Paul Kurtz, who I believe is not able to be here, he just volunteered. He sort of turned out to be moderator. Nobody elected him. He just sort of convened. And then, as some of us faded out, the conservative group just moved right in and took ownership. There are Dale and Alan and people like that. Even if we haven't given you adequate credit, your credit is good with God on this as a gift.
Plus, John Root,